Hey! My name's Helianthus Cryptid, or Nephilim if you prefer. Welcome to my cozy corner of the internet. This is the final chapter of Sitting in a Tin Can, written by Aurorian on AO3. I am sad to have no more chapters to record of this fic, but this is also the first fic I have completed in its entirety. Before I begin the chapter, here are the trigger warnings. This fanfiction includes topics that may be triggering to some viewers. If you are likely to be affected by any of the following: implied homophobia, implied prostitution, and implied drug dealing, then please consider listening to one of my other videos, such as the Age Rose series, which is written by XX Cypress Minerva XX. Now I implore you to sit back and relax whilst I read to you. Chapter 10. Finale. Sitting in a Tin Can. Suga stuck around until Oikawa got his break, and then he begrudgingly brought him into one of the planetarium domes. There wouldn't be any showings for the next hour, so it was probably the quietest place to talk. So, Oikawa said, and sat back in the expensive, soft, front row seat that was meant for two people. How'd you find me here? Suga looked around at the dome in awe. The projector wasn't even turned on, but even Oikawa, who had worked there for 2 years at that point, could appreciate the tall ceilings and the long rows of movie theatre seats behind them. He sat down next to Oikawa on the chair, and rubbed his hand over the navy upholstery. Akashi told me this would make a nice place for a first date. Suga turned his attention back to Oikawa and felt his palms sweat. No. Oikawa shook his head and scoffed slightly. No? Suga asked. This isn't a good place for a date? Oikawa rolled his eyes up to the ceiling. Akashi told you to come here because he knows I work here. He wanted you to find me. Suga nodded slowly. Oh, yeah, I guess that makes sense. He whistled up at the white ceiling above their heads. Still pretty neat, though. If this was any other time, Oikawa would care enough to ask Suga who he was going on a date with, but his palms were sweating and the hair on his forearms was standing up, because he knew that Suga wasn't alone. He worked as a teacher in Miyagi, which meant that he was probably only in Tokyo for a weekend. Planning a date implied he'd brought someone with him, and Oikawa seriously doubted it wasn't someone he knew. So, tell me again why you came looking for me? He asked, because he felt like Suga was hiding a few details from him. He had trouble believing that Suga put so much effort into finding him just because Kaito was struggling with his homework. Suga hesitated, cementing the idea that he wasn't telling the whole truth into Oikawa's mind. Kaito was feeling like a burden to his parents, he said after a beat too long of silence. He thought they were grieving, and didn't want to bother them, knowing that neither his parents were, is kind of cruel. Oikawa agreed. He'd asked Kanami to bring Kaito and Takaru with her more times than he could count, but she'd insisted that they wouldn't be able to keep it a secret, which, fair enough, they were only kids, but Oikawa still missed them. He missed a lot of things, but that didn't mean he could see them, even though he wanted to. You must have gone through a lot of trouble in effort to find me, he mumbled, picking at his cuticles, trying to act casual, he realized, because he didn't want Suga to think that he was guilty, like he was okay with his life, and he didn't regret leaving. His pride would never let him do that. Not really, Suga admitted. I'm actually surprised the police never found you. Oikawa snorted. Suga had too much faith in him. They found me, he said. He looked up from his cuticles to catch Suga's reaction. He was definitely confused, with both of his eyebrows raised, and his mouth slightly agape. They found me a few weeks after I got back into the country. I was squatting in an old construction site by my house, and they found me, he explained. Apparently I was not very good at disappearing, and the people who helped me were worried enough to tell them everything. So the police covered it up? Suga asked. Daichi said he had a feeling. Daichi. That was the name of Karasuno's captain, probably the person Suga was going on a date with. I wouldn't necessarily call it a cover-up. I asked them to close the case quietly without revealing too much detail. They'd only told my parents because I felt like they'd be riding my ass forever if I didn't. Suga was quiet, probably thinking over what Oikawa had just said, maybe even re-evaluating how he had interpreted everything up until that point, or maybe realizing that there was no real mystery for him to solve. I saw your sister in the cafe the day the police told her what happened, he said. I thought she was freaking out because they couldn't find you, but she was actually freaking out because I wouldn't be coming home? Oikawa nodded. Yep, she didn't speak to me for 6 months. Suga bit his lip. And what about Oizumi? Oikawa felt his skin flush cold, freezing him from the outside in, sending a shiver up his spine. What about him? Oikawa asked. Snapped. He wasn't so sure how it came out. The ring in his ears deafened him to anything other than the constant mantra of Oizumi, Oizumi, Oizumi. Suga watched him warily, like he expected Oikawa to lose it right in front of him, and because he'd spoken to Akashi, that's probably exactly what he expected. He's worried about you, Suga said. Oikawa hadn't seen Oizumi in over 5 years. He wondered what he looked like, if he'd gained weight, or if he decided to dye his hair. Would he be exactly the same or completely different? Oikawa wasn't sure which one he would prefer. He'd routinely tried to look him up on social media, but he hadn't been able to find anything. So, you talked to him? Of course he had talked to him. Oizumi had been his best friend. Suga would be stupid not to. Suga's eyes darted to the door of the dome, and Oikawa felt dread sink to the bottom of his stomach like a stone in a pond. He hadn't just spoken with Oizumi. Suga had brought him with him. Of course I did. Oikawa could hear him swallow. Akashi had probably told him about the one time he'd asked about Oizumi. He cringed a lot thinking about breaking down in front of his roommate like that. It was embarrassing, and having to eat his dinner afterwards like he couldn't taste his own tears was even worse. How is he? Oikawa put his hands on his thighs and tried wiping away the sweat. Suga shifted in his seat. He crossed his right leg over his left. You could ask him yourself, he suggested, and reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone. Is he here? Oikawa watched him type in his PIN and open his contacts. He'd called him recently, and for the first time, Oikawa wondered if Suga was actually going on a date with Oizumi. He tried to push down his jealousy because he knew that whatever claim he had over Oizumi went down the drain when he told him Asuka was his girlfriend. Suga looked up from his phone and locked eyes with him, nodding. He said. I can tell him to come here, or we can leave and never bother you again. It's your decision, and I'll respect whatever one you make. Silently, he waited for Oikawa to make his choice. He didn't want to see or talk to Oizumi. The thought filled him with dread. But he knew that Suga was serious. If he said no, he'd probably never see him again, and that thought was filling him with even more dread. He thought of Oizumi growing up without him getting married and raising kids and having a funeral. He thought about not knowing when any of that happened, and none of that being with him. He'd signed up for that when he decided not to come home, but Suga saying it somehow made it feel more real, like he hadn't just spent the last 5 years in complete isolation from his old life. Oikawa closed his eyes and slumped down in his seat. "Okay," he whispered. "Call him. Tell him to come here." Suga's eyes widened like he was surprised, and if Oikawa was being honest, he was surprised himself, and clicked on Iwaizumi's contact. He'd watched Suga hold the phone up to his ear and wait. Oikawa's heart began pounding behind his ribs as Suga smiled when Iwaizumi picked up. "Hey," he said way too cheerfully for how shitty Oikawa felt. Iwaizumi said something that Oikawa couldn't hear, but even the sound of his voice as a muffled hum on the other end of the phone call was making Oikawa panic. "I know," Suga nodded. "I'm with him right now." Suga looked at him like he was trying to read his mind, and Oikawa stared back. He watched him react to the call, his face softened a little at whatever Iwaizumi was saying. "Yeah," he said gently. "Ask Akashi for the address. He's the one who told me where to go." Suga's persistent eye contact broke. He brought his phone away from his ear and looked down at it in surprise. "He hung up on me," he muttered. "Fuck!" Oikawa groaned, and slapped both his hands over his face. "I did not wake up this morning expecting this to happen." Suga snorted like Oikawa had told a joke. "Did you ever think someone would come find you?" Oikawa wasn't sure. He'd always thought that maybe he'd run into someone he knew and would have to explain it all, but he assumed everyone thought he was dead. "I didn't expect you to come looking for me," he admitted. "Iwaizumi is understandable, but you? No." Suga's phone beeped. "Well, he'll be here in the next 10 minutes, he said. "You wanna prepare? I have no idea what to do in this situation." Oikawa straightened up his work clothes and sighed, flapping his hands around to get rid of the built-up jitters. "I'm nervous," he admitted. "This is terrible." Suga patted his knee gently, which sort of comforted Oikawa. Not enough to get rid of the cold sweat clinging to his temples, but enough. He waited with bated breath for exactly 11 minutes and 43 seconds, if his counting was correct, and watched the dome door open so fast it echoed throughout the room. Suga lifted his hand off of Oikawa's knee and stood up. "I guess I'll leave you to it," he said, and brushed past Iwaizumi on the steps, patting his shoulder and giving him a gentle smile. "I'm gonna go book tickets for one of tomorrow's shows." Oikawa watched him leave, avoiding looking at Iwaizumi's approaching figure. He sat in Suga's vacated spot and stared. He felt it burning the side of his face, and he counted to 15 before turning his head slowly, eyes trained on the wall a few meters behind Iwaizumi's head. "Hey!" Iwaizumi was panting like he'd ran a marathon. Oikawa finally looked at him, and bit his lip to stop it from trembling. He wasn't the exact same, nor was he completely different. He looked like him, but older. His frown lines were far more pronounced, and he had purple bags under his eyes. But other than that, it was Iwaizumi. Iwaizumi with a slightly squarer jaw and longer hair, but still Iwaizumi. "Hi," he croaked, and cleared his suddenly way too dry throat. Iwaizumi stared at him for a few moments, at his dark brown instead of chestnut hair, and his eyes trailed down to the same fake glasses he'd worn to spy on the Karasuno Shiratorizawa match. The last time Iwaizumi had seen him in them, he'd comforted him. It was the last nice memory Oikawa had of the two of them. "You know what's funny?" Iwaizumi said, and Oikawa flinched at the sudden noise. He shrugged, not trusting his own voice. After you disappeared, I went to the sports center. Never went in, obviously, but I snuck out my window every night. It's kinda cheesy, but I looked at the stars and thought about that day we went there together, and how you said we should do it again. Oikawa thought about that day a lot too, how he wished he could just stay in that moment, Awaizmi's lips on his own, and the stars shining brightly above their heads. There was a hole in the roof of the sports center, he said. I remember it caving in a few days after I got there, and I used to lie down under it when the weather was nice. I thought about you. Awaizmi grabbed the gold throw pillow from behind his back and held it tightly against his chest. I'm sorry for ignoring you, he whispered. When you said you were dating Hirama, I'm sorry for driving you away. Oikawa listened to his voice crack and pressed his lips together, trying to stop them from quivering. He knew that if Awaizmi cried, he would too. You didn't. His voice was shaky, and he swallowed dryly. It wasn't your fault, I promise. He'd been the one to push Awaizmi away. He had known what he was doing. He just wished that he hadn't. Then why did Akashi say you didn't want to see me again? Oikawa had never seen Awaizmi so vulnerable before. Even as children, he had always been the stronger of the two. He was the ace. His job was to be strong. Oikawa grabbed Awaizmi's right hand and pulled it to his chest. There was no stopping the tears that slowly began building on his lower lash line, blurring his vision. It's not because of you. He lifted up his glasses and scrubbed at his eyes with the hand that wasn't holding Awaizmi's to his chest. It's because I don't... His throat closed up, and he tried to clear it again. 'Cause I don't want you to be disgusted with me. He looked down at his lap, and his tears landed on Awaizmi's hand, like rain. Why would I be disgusted? Awaizmi leaned forward in his seat and brought his other hand up to Oikawa's shoulder, squeezing it tightly. Oikawa shook his head and breathed out of his mouth. Because I had no money, and I had to... Oikawa's nose began to block, and it was making his voice all nasally, so he unsuccessfully tried to sniffle away the build-up. Awaizmi's hold on his shoulder tightened, and then let go. I already know about that. He grabbed Oikawa's chin and made him look at him. I'm not disgusted. Oikawa blinked more tears out of his eyes. But I'm so ashamed, Hajime. He sniffed again and wiped his wet cheeks with his sleeve and watched Awaizmi cry. He was a pretty crier. No snot or dribble, just a red nose and graceful tears. I was just 18, and I couldn't get a job. I had to. His sobs came out like heaving gasps, and he tried to look away, but he couldn't, because Awaizmi's hand was still on his chin. I know, Awaizmi insisted, and I'm still not disgusted. I'm just glad you're okay. Oikawa pushed out a watery breath and ignored the spittle that landed on Awaizmi. I'm so sorry, Hajime. I really am. Awaizmi leaned closer, pulling his hand out of Oikawa's grasp, and cupping both of his cheeks. He was so close, and it finally clicked in Oikawa's brain that this was actually happening. Awaizmi was actually sitting in front of him, brushing his tears away with his thumbs and shushing him quietly, like he wasn't the one in the wrong. I'm sorry too. Awaizmi wiped at his cheeks softly. Hanamaki and Masakawa told me that you were pushing yourself too far. I should have stopped you. Oikawa shook his head and more tears fell. He barely felt them with how wet his face was. I wouldn't have listened. It's my fault that He felt a sharp twinge in his knee. Something his doctor called psychogenic pain. Thinking about the day he'd torn his ligaments to shreds, ruining his future in the process, usually triggered it. I still don't understand why you didn't go to Argentina, Awaizumi mumbled. They offered you a place on the team. Oikawa squeezed his eyes shut. As the assistant coach, he whispered. Not as the setter. How could I have watched somebody else play in my place, when I worked so hard for so long? That's just torture, Iwa-chan. Awaizumi didn't argue, even though he looked like he wanted to. Okay. He brushed a bit of hair away from Oikawa's damp face. I'm sorry for bringing it up. We can talk about something else. Oikawa nodded and bit his swollen lips. Sure, he mumbled. Are you and Sugawara going on a date? Awaizumi looked slightly taken aback, and a flicker of the angry caveman face appeared through his tears. What? Toru, we were just having a really emotionally draining conversation. Oikawa's glasses began to fog up as he cried, so he took them off and threw them aside. He wanted to change the subject as quickly as possible, and that was one of the things pressing against the front of his mind. Sorry, he mumbled. Are you? Awaizumi squeezed Oikawa's face, puffing out his lips like a fish. He tried not to feel embarrassed by how wet his chin was. No, Awaizumi said. Suga's going on a date with the Karasuno captain. Oikawa nodded, so he'd been right before. He tried to push down the relief he felt, because it was the opposite of appropriate. He'd left and disappeared for years. He didn't have the right to jealousy. That's good, he muttered through squished lips. Good? Awaizumi let go of his cheeks, dropping his hands to Oikawa's shoulders. Oikawa licked his lips, tasting the salty tears, and wondered if it was okay to continue this particular conversation. In the end, he decided that he'd left Awaizumi in the dark for too long to keep things from him. Yeah, he confirmed. I hope you aren't dating anyone else, Iwa-chan. Awaizumi massaged his shoulders lightly and stared at the gold pillow in his lap. I missed you calling me that, he admitted, and I'm not dating anyone. Oikawa was a little surprised. But Iwa-chan is so attractive, and his biceps are so big. Why haven't you settled down? It was nice to tease him after crying. He felt lighter than before. He wasn't sure if he'd cried out all of his negative feelings, or if it was just because Awaizumi was sitting right next to him. Awaizumi shrugged and met Oikawa's eyes. You know it's because I love you. Oikawa smiled, even though he felt like he didn't deserve to. I know. Awaizumi's frown appeared again, and he pinched Oikawa. That better not have been a Star Wars reference, shithead, or I'll be the one disappearing. Oikawa sniffed one more time and leaned over a little, kissing Awaizumi chastely on the side of his mouth. I love you too, and I regret telling you that Asuka-chan was my girlfriend. I fucked up everything, and I wish I could go back and fix it. And Awaizumi said, I forgive you, even though Oikawa wasn't sure how he could. Oikawa smoothed out the wrinkles in his bright pink dress with his hands, and picked quietly at the loose thread while they flew. The soft music playing through his earphones lulled him into a somewhat dazed silence. He leaned his head back on the chair and watched the clouds beneath him from the portal. Uji was asleep next to him, her head bent at an awkward angle, and her frail figure slumped over. She hadn't been very talkative before that, though, so Oikawa didn't think it was anything of a loss. He almost regretted not bringing his crutches with him, but he knew that if he wanted to pull this off, he had to leave them at home. It had been 2 months since his surgery, so he didn't really need them. But sometimes acute pain reminded him of what he'd lost. How he was expected to recover and play volleyball again, not professionally, but still to coach and to train other people. He shifted in his seat as he thought of watching his place on the Club Atletico San Juan team being taken away from him. Oikawa wondered if that was just how his life had been planned out, constantly replaced. No matter how hard he pushed himself, he would never be better. Because he pushed himself as hard as he could, and it ended up breaking him. With a forlorn sigh, he looked out the portal again, listening to his soft music and wondering if he would ever be better than what he was.
I don't understand why I have to shut my eyes when I know exactly where we are.
Daichi laughed and felt Suga's fingers press closer to his eyes, brushing up against his eyelashes. Shh. It's supposed to be a surprise. He pushed his chest against Daichi's back, walking them 3 steps forward. I blame Iwa for ruining it. Daichi stumbled blindly. He probably would have fallen if Suga hadn't been hugging his head from behind, trying to keep his sight as limited as possible.
Iwa didn't ruin anything, he said, amused. He announced it pretty loudly before sprinting down the street, but he didn't do it on purpose.
A likely story. Suga giggled into his ear, and Daichi shuddered at the feeling of his breath blowing against the nape of his neck. But I'll give him the benefit of the doubt just this once.
Does that mean you'll take your hands off my eyes? He asked, since I know we're at the planetarium.
Suga removed his hands from Daichi's face and snaked them around his waist instead, propping his chin on Daichi's shoulder. Sad that the surprise was spoiled. Suga squeezed him around the abdomen, and Daichi brought his hands to rest on top of Suga's. He tilted his head to catch a glimpse of Suga, blowing a lock of grey hair out of his way.
If it makes you feel any better, I didn't look it up or anything. I have no idea what it looks like inside.
The apples of Suga's cheeks rounded just enough that Daichi could tell he was smiling. I guess that's good enough, he said. It's pretty great inside. Suga released him from his embrace and grabbed his wrist. Let's go, he said, and led Daichi through the glass doors of the planetarium. They had barely walked 2 steps over the threshold, and Daichi was already impressed. The bright tiles and large windows of the entrance hall gave the room a modern, expensive feel, and Daichi thought that he and Suga looked a little bit out of place. Suga brought 2 tickets up to Daichi's face and fanned him with them. We're in Dome 2 in 10 minutes, he said. I couldn't get the comfy front row seats Oikawa dragged me to yesterday, but we aren't in the very back, so I'm considering it a win.
As long as we're having a cheesy first date, I don't really mind.
Daichi took one of the tickets and put his hand on the small of Suga's back. Suga leaned against him. Cute, he said, as they walked over to the ticket counter together. The dome was huge, with bright white round ceilings and lines of chairs facing a stage at the front. The seats in the front looked more like sofas, while the ones further back were like movie theatre chairs. Daichi checked the number on his ticket and followed Suga to a seat closer to the back than to the front, and watched him collapse into with a sigh. Not too bad for the cheap seats. Suga took Daichi's hand and pulled him into the chair next to him. I'm excited. Daichi pressed a kiss to the soft hair over Suga's temple.
Me too,
he agreed and watched the lights fade out slowly around them. And he was excited, but halfway through the showing, Daichi found himself zoning out. It was beautiful, though. The projections above their heads had him craning his neck so far back, he almost felt it crack. But the words that accompanied the images were what was pulling him to a level of lethargy that had him sinking down into his seat, blinking sluggishly at the ceiling. He felt his body relax to the point where his limbs felt too heavy to move. And suddenly, he was being nudged sharply and he jumped on the spot, rubbing the sleep out of his eyes. You totally fell asleep. Suga laughed, and Daichi looked around him. The lights had been turned back on, and people had already started walking up the steps to the exit.
No, I didn't,
he said and rolled his shoulders, groaning in satisfaction when they popped.
I was just relaxing.
Suga hummed. Okay. What was your favourite part?
The part with the stars, obviously.
Daichi took Suga's hand and stood up. Obviously, he repeated. You did look pretty peaceful, though, so I guess I can forgive you. Suga had taken off the jacket he'd been wearing at some point during the show, and folded it over the crook of his elbow as he stood up.
Sorry for sleeping on our first date.
He walked to the exit hand in hand.
But that was probably the best nap I've had in a while.
No dreams about the vice principal's flying toupee? Suga squeezed Daichi's fingers with his own and snickered behind his free hand. Daichi felt an involuntary shiver run up his spine.
I'd forgotten about that, he grimaced.
It was still bright outside when they left the planetarium. Checking his watch, he realized that it was too late for lunch and too early for dinner. Daichi knew they would have to go back to the hotel soon anyway to get ready to leave, but for a moment he wasn't ready to let Suga go. They walked down the sidewalk, swinging their hands between them like teenagers. I don't want to go back to work tomorrow, Suga groaned.
Shut up, Daichi said. You love your work.
Suga leaned his head against Daichi's. I know, he muttered, but I'd like to spend more time with you. Daichi bit his lip.
Why don't you stay over tonight?
Suga gasped. Are you trying to seduce me, Sawamura? After I watched you snore on our date for half an hour? Daichi shushed him.
I live closer to the school than you do, and we can spend time with each other too.
Suga stopped him with a hand on his bicep. We could stick a movie on and call it a second date. Daichi nodded.
I have 2001: A Space Odyssey, if you're interested.
Sticking to the theme, Suga leaned in slowly. I like it. Their lips pressed together gently, Suga's as pillow-soft as they had been the day before, and Daichi sighed happily, wrapping his arms around Suga's waist and tilting his head. Daichi dished out a serving of agadashi tofu into one of the nice floral pattern bowls he'd never actually had a proper reason to use before. The housewarming gift from his mom had been tucked into the back of the cupboards, collecting dust and being forgotten about. Hey! Suga had called when he had found them. You never told me you had fancy crockery! Daichi had peeked his head into the kitchen with a frown.
I would have told you, but if I'm honest, I have no idea what crockery is.
Suga lifted a porcelain plate to his face and wiped a finger over the rim, removing a small layer of dust. Dishes, he explained. You've got the fancy grandma stuff. He'd used them the next time Kyoko and Tanaka had come over, which of course had led to one of them shattering completely. Daichi wasn't too bothered by it because
He couldn't really say he was overly attached to them, but Tanaka and Suga had both apologized profusely. It was a little funny watching them stumble over disorganized sorries and rust, please forgive me's like two little kids who had hit a baseball through a neighbor's window. He'd had to assure Suga that no, he would not be kicking him out, and that he wasn't even mad. But despite being one fancy grandma plate down, Daichi still pulled the set out every once in a while, like today, when Iwaizumi and Oikawa were coming over for dinner for the first time since they'd reunited. Daichi had called and texted them, and they'd seen each other a good few times, but they hadn't actually arranged anything for the four of them to do in the 6 months since they'd found Oikawa. Not that dinner at Daichi's was overly formal or anything, but it made him feel a lot more adult than usual. Daichi thought the hot air from the stove hitting his face and the friendly chatter from the other room was a comforting feeling. Having more people to hang out with on his nights off was nice. He felt less lonely. Suga knocked on the kitchen doorframe.
"Need any help setting the table?"
he asked. Daichi turned and smiled, handing him a bowl of agadashi tofu. "Please." He proportioned out the rest of the food onto the 3 dishes waiting on the countertop next to him, and took 2. Suga took the other 1, and they set them neatly on the kitchen table, adjusting the cutlery and putting out 4 glasses next to the bowls.
"I feel like we win at domesticity,"
Suga said, and poured green tea into each glass. Daichi walked back over to the stove with a snort and switched it off. "Does that make Iwa and Oikawa our children?" Oikawa came into the kitchen, sat at the head of the table and scoffed.
"Do not talk to me about children," he muttered. "Kanami is forcing me to make up for the 5 years of babysitting that I missed. I'll be happy if I never see a child again. I really don't know how you do it every day, Suga-chan."
According to Suga, Kaito had not taken Oikawa's return well. He'd felt understandably betrayed at both his parents and Oikawa for leaving him in the dark, but in the months that followed, he'd lost his resentment for his uncle. Suga shook his head with a grin.
"Kaito is one of the most well-behaved children in my class," he said, and sat down in the seat next to Oikawa's right. "You're fine."
Oikawa made a noise of protest.
"I'm sure he's an angel at school, but at home he turns into this annoying, moody little gremlin."
Iwaizumi sat across from Suga and to Oikawa's left. "I told you not to move back into your parents' house," he said. "You should have just come and lived with me." As the only two who had actually seen Iwaizumi's apartment, Daichi and Oikawa exchanged a glance as Daichi sat down in the seat at the opposite end of the table.
"Iwa-chan,"
Oikawa put his hand on Iwaizumi's shoulder with a look of pity.
"I hate to be the one to tell you this, but I could never live in your tiny apartment comfortably."
Iwaizumi rolled his eyes to the sky and sighed like it physically pained him to hold himself back.
"My bad," he said. "I forgot how fucking big your head is. We'd never get it through the door."
Oikawa blew a raspberry at him and turned his attention to Daichi.
"Thank you for the food," he said.
"You're welcome." Daichi picked up his chopsticks. Suga reached across the corner of the table and placed his calloused fingers over the back of Daichi's hand with a smile.
"Thanks."
Daichi turned his hand over so their palms pressed against one another's and slotted his fingers between Suga's. "You're welcome," he repeated, albeit a lot softer and with a smile a lot fonder. And looking at him, Daichi realized that Suga had turned him helpless at 15. But sitting next to him with their hands pressed as tightly together as they could, he didn't like to think he felt like that much anymore. That's all, folks. That's a wrap. That was the end of Sitting in a Tin Can.
Thank you so much to Aurorian for letting me read this fanfiction. I appreciate it so much. Thank you so much for watching this video. I appreciate all the support you've given me. If you have any suggestions, leave them in the comments below. All credits go to the original creator of this fanfiction, Aurorian on AO3. I would highly appreciate it if you gave this video a like and you subscribe to the channel and you hit the notification bell to be notified of when I next upload. There is no pressure to do so though. Thank you for visiting my cozy corner of the internet. Keep growing my sunflowers. Mwah!